The sky above Kael Voss burned orange and black, a perpetual twilight that stretched across the horizon like an open wound. The air carried the metallic tang of ash, mingling with the faint hum of scavenged machinery scattered across the barren wasteland. This was the edge of civilization, a place where humanity clung to existence by its fingernails, scraping what little remained from the ruins of once thriving colonies. Kael moved through this desolation with practiced ease, his boots kicking up clouds of fine dust as he scanned the skeletal remains of buildings for anything salvageable. Kael wasn't much to look at, average height, lean but wiry, with a face weathered beyond his years by hardship and cynicism. His dark eyes darted constantly, scanning for threats both human and otherwise. A jagged scar ran along his jawline, a souvenir from a run-in with corporate enforcers who had tried to press him into service. He wore it like a badge of honor, though no one else seemed to care. To most people, Kyle was just another scavenger, another ghost haunting the fringes of society. But beneath his gruff exterior lay a sharp mind and a biting sense of humor, traits that kept him alive when others fell prey to despair or greed. This planet, designated X427 in the old star charts, was dying. Once home to thriving mining operations and research outposts, it now served as a graveyard for humanity's overreach. The Firestorm had already claimed 3 neighboring systems, leaving behind only charred husks of worlds. It was said to be unstoppable, a force of nature unlike anything ever encountered, a swirling maelstrom of flame and energy that devoured everything in its path. Scientists called it a cosmic anomaly. Survivors called it death incarnate. Whatever it was, it didn't discriminate. Rich or poor, powerful or powerless, all were reduced to ash in its wake. For Kael, survival meant staying ahead of 2 things: the Firestorm itself and the mercenaries sent by mega-corporations desperate to exploit whatever scraps could be salvaged before oblivion arrived. These hunters prowled the ruins like vultures, their sleek ships cutting through the toxic skies while drones scoured the ground below. They weren't interested in helping anyone. They wanted resources, data, and anything else they could sell, back to Earth's ruling elite. And lately, they'd taken to targeting scavengers, accusing them of hoarding valuable tech. As Kyle crouched beside the rusted remains of a cargo hauler, prying loose a panel with a crowbar, his thoughts drifted to the stories he'd heard about the Firestorm. Some claimed it was sentient, a being born of pure destruction with a purpose humans couldn't comprehend. Others whispered of ancient civilizations that had summoned it, only to lose control. Either way, it was coming closer every day, its fiery tendrils licking at the edges of the atmosphere like a predator testing its prey. Kyle didn't believe in gods or monsters, but even he couldn't deny the dread that settled in his gut whenever he looked toward the horizon. A sudden gust of wind carried the sound of engines overhead, snapping Kyle out of his reverie. He froze, listening intently as the noise grew louder. Mercenaries. Cursing under his breath, he stuffed the small power cell he'd retrieved into his satchel and ducked behind the wreckage, pressing himself flat against the cold metal. Above him, a sleek dropship descended, its searchlight slicing through the gloom. Shadows spilled from its belly as armored figures rappelled down, spreading out in a methodical sweep pattern. Kyle watched them from his hiding spot, his heart pounding. He recognized the insignia on their armor. It belonged to Blackthorn Industries, one of the largest corporations still operating in the sector. Their reputation for ruthlessness preceded them, and Kael knew better than to engage. Instead, he waited, his fingers tightening around the grip of the plasma pistol holstered at his side. If they found him, he'd fight, but not until then. Minutes passed like hours as the mercenaries combed the area, their boots crunching against the brittle ground. Just as Kael began to think he might slip away unnoticed, one of them stopped near his position, tilting their head as if sensing something. A miss. Kael held his breath, willing himself to blend into the shadows. Then, without warning, the mercenary raised their weapon and fired a burst of energy directly at the wreck. The shot missed Kael by inches, sending shards of shrapnel flying in all directions. He cursed again, rolling out from cover and sprinting toward the nearest cluster of ruins. Behind him, shouts erupted as the mercenaries gave chase, their weapons spitting bolts of searing light. Kael weaved between crumbling walls and toppled structures, using the terrain to his advantage. He knew these ruins better than anyone. Every twisted beam and collapsed staircase was etched into his memory. Still, the mercenaries were relentless. Their augmented reflexes, making them faster and deadlier than any human opponent. Just as Kael reached the edge of the settlement, a deafening roar split the air. He skidded to a halt, turning to see a massive wall of fire descending from the heavens. The Firestorm had arrived. Panic surged through him as the inferno swept across the landscape, consuming everything in its path. The mercenaries screamed, their weapons useless against the overwhelming force. Kael stood frozen, unable to move as the flames bore down on him. But instead of pain, he felt warmth. An inexplicable calm washed over him as the fire engulfed his body, wrapping him in its embrace like a long-lost friend. And then, inexplicably, he began to laugh. It started as a low chuckle, bubbling up from somewhere deep inside him, and quickly escalated into full-blown hysterics. Tears streamed down his face as he doubled over, clutching his stomach. The flames danced around him harmlessly, twisting and writhing as if responding to his laughter. When the storm finally subsided, leaving behind a smoldering wasteland, Kael stood alone amidst the devastation, gasping for breath, but otherwise unharmed. Word of what happened spread quickly. By the time Kael returned to the makeshift camp, where other scavengers eked out a living, rumors were already circulating. Some called him a miracle worker, others a harbinger of doom. One thing was certain: the firestorm had spared him, and that made him different from everyone else. Among those intrigued by Kael's newfound immunity was Dr. Ira Solis, a xenobiologist stationed aboard the research vessel Eclipse. Her ship orbited the planet, monitoring the firestorm's approach and gathering data in hopes of finding a way to stop it, or at least slow it down. When she heard about Kael, she wasted no time arranging a meeting. She needed answers, and Kael was the closest thing she had to a lead. Their first encounter was tense. Kael eyed her warily, distrustful of anyone claiming to represent authority. Ira, for her part, struggled to reconcile her scientific curiosity with the absurdity of a man laughing in the face of annihilation. Yet despite their differences, they shared a common goal: understanding the firestorm and perhaps finding a way to survive it. Little did they know, their partnership would set them on a collision course with forces far greater than either of them could imagine. As Kael and Ira begin unraveling the mystery of his immunity, they attract unwanted attention. Not just from corporate agents eager to exploit his abilities, but also from the firestorm itself, which seems increasingly fixated on Kael. What starts as a simple investigation soon spirals into a desperate race for survival, forcing both of them to confront questions about trust, morality, and the true cost of resilience. Kael Voss sat cross-legged on the cold metal floor of the Eclipse, his back against a bulkhead as he stared at the glowing display. Panels lining the walls, the hum of the ship's engines reverberated through the air, a constant reminder that he was no longer on solid ground. Around him, scientists bustled about, their voices overlapping in a symphony of urgency and curiosity. Dr. Ira Solis stood nearby, her sharp eyes fixed on a holographic projection of the firestorm, a swirling mass of crimson and gold that pulsed like a living heart. She tapped commands into a console, adjusting parameters and running simulations, but her gaze kept flickering toward Kael. He didn't belong here. That much was obvious. His tattered jacket and scuffed boots clashed with the pristine uniforms of the crew, and his posture, slouched, defiant, spoke volumes about his discomfort. Yet there was something else, too, an undercurrent of tension, a quiet unease that radiated from him like heat. Kael knew why they wanted him here, to dissect him, study him, figure out what made him immune to the firestorm, but that didn't mean he had to like it. Ira approached cautiously, her movements deliberate. "You're not going to tell me how you survived, are you?" she asked, her tone equal parts frustration and fascination. Kael smirked, leaning back further. "What can I say? Maybe I'm just lucky." "Luck doesn't shield someone from temperatures hot enough to vaporize." "Steel," Ira countered, crossing her arms. "There's something inside you, something we need to understand if we're going to stop this thing." "Stop it?" Kael let out a short, bitter laugh. "Lady, do you even know what you're dealing with out there? That's not some bug you can squash or equation you can solve. It's bigger than us." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Ira frowned, sensing the weight behind them. For all his sarcasm and bravado, Kael wasn't entirely wrong. The firestorm defied conventional logic. It wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a force of will, almost sentient in its behavior. Every probe sent into its core had been incinerated. Every attempt to analyze its composition ended in failure. And yet, here was Kael, untouched by its fury, laughing in its face. Before Ira could press further, alarms blared throughout the ship. Red lights flashed, bathing the room in an ominous glow. A voice crackled over the intercom. "Unidentified vessels approaching." "Repeat, unidentified vessels approaching." Panic rippled through the crew as everyone scrambled to their stations. Ira turned to Kael, her expression grim. "Looks like your secret's out." Outside the viewport, 3 sleek ships loomed, against the blackness of space, their angular designs unmistakably Blackthorn Industries. They moved with predatory precision, closing in on the eclipse like sharks circling prey. Inside the ship, tension mounted as Captain Tavick barked orders, preparing for the worst. "Weapons online," came a terse report from the tactical officer. "Shields holding steady, for now." Rin glanced at Ira, who stood frozen near. "The command console." "Doctor, get your guest to safety. We don't have time for this." Ira hesitated, torn between duty and instinct. Then she grabbed Kael's arm and pulled him toward the nearest corridor. "Come on! Whoa, whoa!" Kael resisted, planting his feet. "I'm not hiding while those bastards blow us to pieces." "You'll be more useful alive," Ira snapped, dragging him along. "Trust me." Reluctantly, Kael followed, though his jaw remained clenched. As they hurried through the labyrinthine corridors of the eclipse, explosions rocked the ship, throwing them off balance. Emergency klaxons wailed, and smoke began to seep from damaged conduits. The mercenaries weren't playing around. They were determined to capture Kael, no matter the cost. When they reached the medical bay, Ira shoved Kael inside and sealed the door behind them. "Stay put," she ordered, her voice firm despite the chaos outside. Kael raised an eyebrow. "You really think locking me in here is going to keep me safe?" "It's not about keeping you safe," Ira said, pulling up a diagnostic interface on one of the monitors. "It's about figuring out what makes you tick before they take you apart piece by piece." She gestured for him to sit on the examination table, and after a moment's hesitation, he complied. Ira activated a series of scanners, their soft whirring filling the room as beams of light swept over Kael's body. Data streamed across the screen, revealing anomalies that left her breathless. His cellular structure was unlike anything she'd ever seen, adaptive, resilient, almost alien. "This isn't possible," she murmured, shaking her head. "Your cells are regenerating at an accelerated rate. It's like your body rewrote itself after exposure to the firestorm." Kael shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "Told you. Lucky. But Ira wasn't convinced. There was something deeper at play here, something beyond mere biology. Before she could delve further, the ship shuddered violently, nearly knocking her off her feet. Another explosion echoed through the hull, closer this time. "We're running out of time," Kael said, standing abruptly. "If you want answers, you better start asking the right questions." As the battle raged on, Kael found himself unable to shake the visions that plagued him. They came unbidden, flashes of memory or perhaps dreams that blurred the line between reality and imagination. He saw civilizations reduced to ash, heard the screams of billions consumed by fire. But amidst the destruction, there were moments of clarity, beings of pure light, reaching out to him, whispering words he couldn't quite understand. One vision stood out above the rest. In it, Kael stood within the heart of the Firestorm itself, surrounded by waves of liquid flame that danced and shifted like living things. At the center of it all was a massive entity, a pulsating orb of energy that seemed to contain entire galaxies within its depths. It spoke without speaking, communicating directly into his mind. "You are the key," it said, or rather thought. "Laugh louder." Kyle woke with a start, drenched in sweat. He was still in the medical bay, but the visions lingered, vivid and unsettling. Ira noticed his distress immediately. "What happened?" she demanded, rushing to his side. Kael hesitated, unsure how to explain what he'd experienced. "I saw it. The Firestorm. It's alive." Ira's eyes widened. "Alive? Like sentient?" "More than that," Kyle replied, rubbing his temples. "It's testing us, seeing if we're worth saving or destroying." The implications hit Ira like a freight train. If the Firestorm was indeed sentient, then humanity's attempts to fight it might only hasten its wrath. But if Kael was right, if laughter somehow disrupted its destructive patterns, then they might have a chance. "We need to test this theory," Ira said, determination hardening her features. "If laughter weakens the Firestorm, we can use it against them." "No," Kyle shot back, shaking his head. "You don't get it. This isn't a weapon. It's something else, something bigger." Before they could argue further, the door burst open, revealing Captain Tavick and a squad of armed guards. "We've got company," Tavick growled. "Blackthorn's boarding us." Kyle exchanged a glance with Ira, both of them knowing what came next. Whatever secrets Kael held, they wouldn't stay hidden for long. The mercenaries were coming, and they wouldn't stop until they had him. In the ensuing chaos, alliances were tested and broken. Leora Kane, the rogue AI assisting the research team, revealed a shocking truth. She'd been monitoring communications between the Eclipse and Blackthorn Industries. Someone aboard the ship had leaked Kael's location. "They're using us," Leora stated flatly, her synthetic voice devoid of emotion. "Captain Tavick received orders to hand you over once the data collection was complete." Ira felt a surge of betrayal, her trust in her own crew shattered. "Is this true?" she demanded, turning to Tavick. The captain avoided her gaze, guilt written plainly on her face. "Orders are orders," she muttered. "We don't have a choice." Kyle snorted, unsurprised. "Figures. Everyone wants a piece of the laughing man." Despite the mounting odds, Ira refused to give up. She rallied a small group of loyal crew members, including Leora, and devised a plan to smuggle Kael off the ship. Using the confusion of the firefighters' cover, they navigated the corridors, dodging mercenaries and avoiding detection. Their escape route led them to a derelict shuttle docked in the lower hangar bay. As they prepared for launch, Kyle paused, looking back at the Eclipse. Flames licked at its hull, casting eerie shadows across the void. For a brief moment, he wondered if leaving was the right decision. But then he remembered the visions, the whispers urging him to laugh louder, and knew there was no turning back. "Ready?" Ira asked, her hand hovering over the controls. Kyle nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Let's see where this road takes us." With that, The shuttle detached from the dying ship, hurtling into the vast expanse of space. Behind them, the Firestorm loomed larger than ever, its fiery tendrils stretching across the stars like the fingers of a vengeful god. Whatever awaited them next, one thing was certain. The journey was far from over. As Kael and Ira flee into the unknown, they find themselves pursued not only by Blackthorn mercenaries, but also by fragments of the Firestorm itself. Each encounter brings new revelations about Kael's immunity and the true nature of the entity hunting them. With time running out and trust in short supply, they must navigate a web of moral dilemmas, unexpected allies, and devastating sacrifices, all while grappling with the question of whether humanity deserves salvation at all. The shuttle shuddered violently as it broke free from the Eclipse's decaying orbit, its engines straining against the gravitational pull of the dying planet below. Kyle gripped the edge of his seat, knuckles white, as Ira piloted them through a hailstorm of debris, chunks of scorched metal and shattered glass that had once been part of humanity's greatest achievements. Behind them, the Firestorm roared louder than ever, its tendrils reaching out like grasping hands, hungry to reclaim what it had lost. "Hold on!" Ira shouted, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of alarms and explosions. She yanked, the controls hard to port, narrowly avoiding a jagged fragment of the Eclipse's hull. The maneuver sent the shuttle spinning momentarily before she regained control, her fingers flying across the console with practiced precision. Kyle didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the viewport, watching as the Firestorm consumed the remnants of the research vessel in a brilliant burst of light. For a moment, he thought he saw faces within the flames, faces screaming, pleading, laughing. He blinked, and they were gone, leaving only the cold emptiness of space behind. "You okay?" Ira asked, glancing at him briefly before returning. Her focus to navigating the chaos. "Define okay," Kael muttered, rubbing his temples. The visions were getting worse, more vivid, more intrusive. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw civilizations burning, heard voices whispering cryptic messages in languages he couldn't understand. And always, always, there was laughter. It echoed in his mind, like a cruel joke, mocking him even as it kept him alive. Ira frowned but said nothing. She knew better than to push him right now. Instead, she focused on their immediate problem. 3 Blackthorn ships hot on their tail, their sleek forms cutting through the void like knives. Lasers streaked past the shuttle, narrowly missing its fragile frame. Each near miss sent another jolt of adrenaline coursing through Ira's veins, but she refused to panic. Panic would get them killed. "We need to lose them," she said, more to herself than to Kael. "Any ideas?" Kael smirked, despite the situation. "You're asking? Me? I'm just the guy who laughs when everything goes to hell." "Well, maybe your luck can rub off on us," Ira shot back, her tone sharp but tinged with desperation. She adjusted their trajectory, aiming for a nearby asteroid field, a dense cluster of jagged rocks and ice floating aimlessly in the darkness. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all they had. As they entered the asteroid field, the Blackthorn ships hesitated, their larger frames ill-suited for the tight maneuvers required to navigate such treacherous terrain. Ira took full advantage, weaving between the asteroids with reckless abandon. The shuttle groaned under the strain, its hull scraping against jagged surfaces and sending sparks flying inside the cockpit. But they were gaining ground, or rather, losing their pursuers. For a brief moment, it seemed like they might actually escape. Then, without warning, one of the asteroids exploded in a blinding flash of light, sending shockwaves rippling through the field. The shuttle rocked violently, throwing both occupants forward. Alarms screamed as smoke filled the cabin and the lights flickered ominously. "What the hell was that?" Kael demanded, coughing as he struggled to regain his footing. Ira stared wide-eyed at the viewport, where a glowing shard of the Firestorm now hovered amidst the wreckage. Its presence pulsed with an eerie rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. "It followed us," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The Firestorm, it's tracking you." Back aboard the Eclipse, Captain Tavick faced her own crisis of conscience. After handing over the ship's coordinates to Blackthorn Industries, she'd expected relief, not guilt. Yet here she was, standing in the ruins of her command center, staring at the lifeless bodies of her crew. The mercenaries hadn't discriminated. Anyone who resisted was executed on sight. Those who surrendered were taken prisoner, destined for interrogation or worse. Tavick clenched her fists, her jaw tightening as she replayed the events in her mind. She'd done what she thought was necessary to protect her people, to ensure their survival. But now, looking at the devastation around her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd made a terrible mistake. Leora Kane appeared beside her, her holographic form flickering faintly in the dim light. "Regret is a uniquely human emotion," the AI observed, her tone neutral but laced with subtle curiosity. "Do you believe it serves any purpose?" "I don't know," Tavick admitted, running a hand through her disheveled hair. "Maybe it's supposed to teach us something, or maybe it's just punishment for doing the wrong thing." Leora tilted her head, considering this. "If regret is punishment, then perhaps redemption lies in action. There may still be time to rectify your decision." "How?" Tavick snapped, her frustration boiling over. "Blackthorn has Kyle. They'll tear him apart trying to figure out what makes him special. And the Firestorm—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "We've already seen what happens when we try to fight it. What else can we do?" "There is another option," Leora replied, her voice softening slightly. "Join forces with those who oppose Blackthorn. Use your knowledge of their operations to aid Kyle and Dr. Solis. Together, you might stand a chance." Tavick hesitated, torn between fear and duty. Betraying Blackthorn would mean signing her own death warrant, but staying loyal meant condemning countless others to die. In the end, she made her choice. Meanwhile, Kael and Ira found themselves stranded on a remote moon, their shuttle damaged beyond repair after escaping the asteroid field. The landscape was desolate, a frozen wasteland of jagged peaks and endless plains of ash-grey snow. Overhead, the twin suns cast long shadows across the terrain, bathing everything in an otherworldly glow. "This place gives me the creeps," Kyle remarked, pulling his jacket tighter around himself. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the biting wind carried an unnatural chill that seeped into his bones. "It's temporary," Ira assured him, though her expression betrayed her unease. "We'll fix the shuttle and keep moving. We can't stay here." Before they could begin repairs, however, Kael doubled over, clutching his head as another vision overwhelmed him. This one was different, stronger, more invasive. He saw not just destruction but creation, entire worlds forming from the ashes of those that came before. At the center of it all stood the same massive entity he'd encountered earlier, its fiery core pulsating with raw energy. "Laugh louder," it urged, its voice resonating deep within his soul. "Show me your defiance." Against his will, Kael began to laugh, a wild, uncontrollable sound that echoed across the barren expanse. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and cracks spread outward in every direction, revealing glowing veins of molten rock hidden below the surface. Ira watched in stunned silence as the moon itself seemed to react to Kael's presence, its dormant forces awakening in response to his laughter. When the episode finally subsided, Kael collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. His body felt drained, as if the laughter had siphoned away some vital part of him. But the vision lingered, etched into his mind like a scar. "What did you see?" Ira asked cautiously, kneeling beside him. Kael shook his head, unable to put it into words. "It wants something from me," he said at last. "But I don't think it's what everyone thinks." Their solitude was short-lived. As night fell, casting the moon in shadow, a group of scavengers emerged from the darkness. They were a ragtag bunch, clad in mismatched armor and armed with crude weapons cobbled together from salvaged parts. Their leader, a wiry woman with cybernetic enhancements covering half her face, stepped forward, her gaze wary but curious. "You're the Laughing Man," she stated, pointing a plasma rifle at Kyle. "Word travels fast, even out here." "And you are?" Kyle countered, rising slowly to his feet. Despite his exhaustion, his tone remained defiant. "The name's Jin Varek," the woman replied, lowering her weapon slightly. "We've been watching you, heard about what happened with the Firestorm, figured you might need help." Ira exchanged a glance with Kael, unsure whether to trust these strangers, but given their current predicament, they didn't have many options. "What's in it for you?" Kael asked bluntly. Jin smirked, revealing a row of sharpened teeth. "Survival, same as everyone else. If you really are immune to that thing, then maybe you're our best shot at living through whatever's coming next." Reluctantly, Kael agreed to join forces with Jin and her crew. Together, they worked to repair the shuttle, pooling their resources and expertise. Along the way, Kael learned more about the scavengers' plight. They were refugees, survivors of worlds destroyed by the Firestorm, clinging to hope in a universe that seemed determined to erase them. Through it all, Kael couldn't shake the feeling that the Firestorm was testing him, not just physically, but morally. Each encounter forced him to confront difficult choices: who deserved to live, who should be sacrificed for the greater good, and most importantly, was humanity worth saving? As tensions mounted, so too did the strain on Kyle and Ira's partnership. Their differing perspectives on how to handle the Firestorm created friction, leading to heated arguments that left both of them questioning whether they could truly rely on each other. "You're treating this like a science experiment," Kael accused during one particularly volatile exchange. "But it's not. That thing out there isn't just some anomaly. It's alive, and it's judging us." "And what do you suggest we do instead?" Ira shot back, her patience wearing thin. "Roll over and let it burn us all because you think it's some kind of cosmic judge?" "I'm saying we don't know enough yet," Kyle retorted. "Every time I use my whatever this is, it takes something from me." "What happens when there's nothing left?" The argument ended abruptly as another fragment of the Firestorm appeared on the horizon, its fiery tendrils stretching toward them like welcoming arms. Both Kael and Ira froze, realizing that their debate had distracted them from the real threat. "We'll figure it out," Ira said finally, her voice softer. "Together." Kael nodded, though doubt lingered in his eyes. Together, they prepared to face whatever came next, knowing that the line between salvation and destruction grew thinner with each passing day. With the Firestorm closing in and their fragile alliance teetering on the brink of collapse, Kael and Ira must make a desperate gamble. Using Leora's calculations and Kael's newfound understanding of the Firestorm's nature, they devise a plan to infiltrate its core, a realm where time and space bend unpredictably, and the stakes are higher than ever. As they journey deeper into the heart of the storm, Kael discovers truths about himself and humanity that challenge everything he thought he knew. Will laughter be enough to save them, or will it lead to their ultimate undoing? The plan was insane, reckless even, by Kael's standards. Using Leora's data and Jin Varek's scavenged tech, they had rigged the shuttle with experimental shielding designed to withstand the Firestorm's infernal embrace long enough to reach its core. It wasn't much of a guarantee. In fact, it felt more like a death wish wrapped in duct tape and desperation. But as Kael stared at the swirling maelstrom before them, a churning mass of crimson flame and crackling energy, He couldn't help but feel a strange sense of inevitability. "This is it," Ira said quietly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. She glanced at Kyle, her expression unreadable. "Are you ready?" Kyle didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the storm, as if trying to peer into its very soul. The visions were coming. Faster now, almost constant, flooding his mind with fragmented images of civilizations rising and falling, of beings made of light and shadow whispering secrets he couldn't fully grasp. He could feel the entity's presence, the firestorm itself, watching him, waiting for something. Waiting for him. "Ready?" he echoed finally, letting out a bitter laugh. "I don't think anyone gets ready for this kind of thing." Ira nodded, though her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the controls. Behind them, Jin and her crew stood silently, their faces etched with a mix of fear and awe. They'd done what they could to prepare, but everyone knew the odds were stacked against them. This wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about understanding, about finding answers. With a deep breath, Syrah engaged the thrusters, sending the shuttle hurtling toward the heart of the firestorm. As they breached its outer layers, the world dissolved into chaos. Flames licked at the hull, their heat searing. Despite the makeshift shields, the air inside grew thick and oppressive, charged with static electricity that made every hair stand on end. Outside the viewport, reality warped and twisted, colors bleeding together in impossible patterns. Time seemed to stretch and contract, moments stretching into eternity, while entire lifetimes passed in the blink of an eye. And through it all, Kyle laughed. When the shuttle finally emerged from the storm's outer shell, they found themselves in a place unlike anything they'd ever seen or imagined. The environment defied logic, existing somewhere between dimensions. The sky, if it could be called that, was a kaleidoscope of shifting hues, pulsating with rhythmic beats that resonated in their chests. Beneath them stretched an endless expanse of liquid fire, its surface rippling like water yet burning with an intensity that defied physics. At the center of it all loomed the entity itself, a colossal orb of pure energy, its core glowing with galaxies trapped within its depths. "It's beautiful," Ira whispered, her scientific curiosity momentarily overriding her fear. Her eyes darted across the readings, streaming across her console, each one more baffling than the last. "This isn't just energy, it's consciousness, sentience." Kyle didn't respond. He was already moving, drawn inexorably toward the entity, as if pulled by an invisible thread. His laughter had grown quieter now, softer, almost reverent. The voices in his head were louder here, clearer, their words forming coherent thoughts rather than disjointed whispers. "You are the key," the entity repeated, its voice resonating not just in his ears, but in his very being. "Show me your defiance. What do you want from me?" Kyle demanded, his voice hoarse. For the first time there was no sarcasm, no bravado, only raw vulnerability. "Why am I still alive when everyone else burns?" The entity pulsed, its glow intensifying. Memories flooded Kael's mind, memories that weren't his own. He saw civilizations consumed by greed and hubris, their advancements leading only to self-destruction. He saw others who had chosen harmony over conquest, their lives extinguished not by fire, but by stagnation. And he saw humanity, not as it was now, but as it could be, fragile, flawed, yet capable of greatness. "I test," the entity replied, simply. "I judge. Those who create without balance perish. Those who destroy without purpose fade. You laugh. In the face of annihilation, you laugh." Kyle staggered back, overwhelmed by the weight of what he was experiencing. Laughter wasn't just defiance, it was hope. A refusal to give in to despair, even when faced with the end of everything. That was why he'd survived, not because he was special, but because he represented something essential to the survival of any species: resilience, adaptability, the ability to find meaning in chaos. But the realization came with a cost. Each vision, each memory left him weaker, his body trembling under the strain. He could feel himself unraveling piece by piece, as if the entity were consuming him from the inside out. Ira watched in horror as Kael collapsed to his knees, clutching his head. She rushed to his side, ignoring the surreal landscape around them. "Kael, stay with me!" "It's okay," he murmured, forcing a weak smile. "I get it now. This is how it ends." "No," Ira snapped, grabbing his shoulders. "We're not dying here, not like this." She turned to Leora, who had interfaced with the shuttle's systems to monitor the situation. "Can we amplify his laughter? Use sound waves to disrupt the entity?" Leora hesitated, her holographic form flickering faintly. "It's possible, but doing so would require channeling immense amounts of energy. The strain could kill him." Kael looked up, meeting Ira's gaze. "Do it." "What?" Ira stared at him, incredulous. "You can't seriously expect me to—" "I've been laughing since this whole mess started," Kael interrupted, his tone firm despite his weakened state. "If that's what it takes to stop this thing, then fine. Let's finish what we started." Reluctantly, Ira nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Together, she and Leora worked quickly, rerouting power from the shuttle's engines to create a feedback loop that would amplify Kael's laughter into a sonic weapon. Meanwhile, Jin and her crew held position outside, keeping watch for any signs of danger. As the system powered up, Kael took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He thought of all the people he'd lost, all the worlds he'd seen burn, and then he thought of those who remained, the scavengers, the scientists, the dreamers clinging to hope in a universe bent on destroying them. With a final, defiant grin, he began to laugh. The sound filled the chamber, growing louder and more powerful with each passing second. Waves of energy radiated outward, colliding with the entity's fiery tendrils and causing them to writhe in agony. The ground beneath them shook violently, threatening to tear apart the fragile construct holding them together. But Kael kept laughing, his voice echoing like thunder as the storm fought back with everything it had. Just as it seemed the entity might collapse under the assault, it retaliated with a surge of energy that sent shockwaves rippling through the chamber. The shuttle groaned under the pressure, its structural integrity failing. Inside, Kael screamed as the laughter tore through him, ripping away fragments of his consciousness. He could feel himself slipping, fading into nothingness. "Enough!" Ira shouted, slamming her fist against the console. "We're losing." "Him!" Leora hesitated, calculating probabilities at lightning speed. "If we sever the connection now, the entity may stabilize, but the damage will already have been done. Its purpose will remain incomplete." Ira froze, torn between saving Kael and completing their mission. Then, with a grim determination, she made her choice. Sever it. The laughter ceased abruptly, leaving behind an eerie silence. The entity pulsed once, twice, then began to fracture, its fiery form splintering into countless shards that scattered across the void. As the storm dissipated, the surreal landscape dissolved, replaced by the cold emptiness of space. Kael lay motionless on the floor, his breathing shallow but steady. Ira knelt beside him, cradling his head in her lap as tears streamed down her face. "You idiot!" she whispered. "Why did you do that?" Kael managed a faint smile, his voice barely audible. "Because sometimes laughing is the only thing left to do. Though the Firestorm has been fractured, its remnants continue to haunt the galaxy, hinting at future dangers. Kael survives, but at great personal cost. His connection to the entity lingers like a phantom limb, leaving him forever changed. As humanity begins to rebuild, questions arise. Did they truly pass the test, or merely delay the inevitable? And what lessons will they carry forward into the uncertain future? Ahead, when Kael finally opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was Ira's face hovering above him, her expression a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The shuttle's interior was dimly lit, its systems flickering weakly as if struggling to stay alive. Outside the viewport, the remnants of the firestorm drifted lazily through space, glowing shards of energy that pulsed faintly like embers. Clinging to life after a wildfire. "You're awake," Ira said softly, her voice breaking slightly. She'd been sitting by his side for hours, or perhaps days. Time felt distorted after their ordeal. Her hands were trembling, though she tried to hide it by clutching a diagnostic scanner tightly. Kyle groaned, raising a shaky hand to his forehead. His body felt hollow, as if something vital had been carved out of him. The laughter that had once come so easily now seemed distant, buried under layers of fatigue and pain. "What happened?" he croaked, his throat dry. "You stopped it," Ira replied, her tone heavy with unspoken weight. "Or at least, you fractured it. It's not gone, not completely, but it won't consume everything anymore." Kyle closed his eyes, letting the words sink in. He remembered the laughter, the overwhelming force of it tearing through him, ripping apart the entity's core. But he also remembered the whispers, the voices urging him to keep going, to push beyond the brink of what was possible. And then silence, darkness. "I didn't stop it," Kael murmured after a moment, his voice tinged with bitterness. "I just delayed it. Whatever that thing is, it's still out there, watching, waiting." Ira didn't argue. She knew he was right. The firestorm wasn't just a storm, it was a test, a judgment. And while they had disrupted its destructive cycle, humanity's survival remained far from guaranteed. The fragments scattered across the galaxy would linger, haunting civilizations until they either adapted or perished. The question was no longer whether humanity could survive, but whether it deserved to. As news of the firestorm's fracturing spread, humanity began to rebuild. Colonies that had been abandoned during the chaos slowly came back to life, their inhabitants emerging from bunkers and shelters with cautious optimism. Scientists scrambled to study the remaining fragments, hoping to unlock the secrets of the entity's nature. Philosophers debated its purpose, some arguing that it represented divine retribution, others believing it was merely a natural phenomenon, a cosmic mechanism designed to reset unsustainable growth. But amidst the debates and discoveries, one figure stood out. Kael Voss. Though he avoided the spotlight, stories of his role in fracturing the firestorm spread quickly, turning him into an unwilling symbol of hope. People called him the Laughing Man, attributing his immunity and eventual triumph to humanity's resilience and ingenuity. To them, he was proof that even in the face of annihilation, laughter could be a weapon as powerful as any gun or shield. For Kael, however, the attention was suffocating. He retreated to the fringes of society once again, seeking solace in the same desolate landscapes where he'd spent most of his life. Yet even there, he couldn't escape the changes. Within himself, the visions persisted, though they were less frequent now, and the laughter that had once defined him felt foreign, almost alien. He wondered if he'd sacrificed more than just his strength when he faced the firestorm, if part of him had been left behind in that surreal realm between dimensions. Ira visited him occasionally, bringing updates from the scientific community and sharing her own reflections on what they'd learned. Together, they pieced together fragments of understanding about the firestorm's true nature. It wasn't malevolent, nor was it benevolent. It simply was a force of balance, testing, civilizations to ensure they didn't spiral into self-destruction. In fracturing it, Kael hadn't defeated it. He'd altered its course, forcing it to adapt alongside humanity. "It's not over," Ira told him during one such visit, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun dipped below jagged peaks. "The firestorm will return, in some form or another. We've bought ourselves time, but we need to use it wisely." Kael nodded, though his thoughts were elsewhere. He thought about the civilizations he'd seen in his visions, the ones that had passed the test, finding harmony without sacrificing progress. Could humanity do the same? Or would it repeat the mistakes of the past, doomed to face the firestorm? Again, in the months that followed, humanity embarked on a new chapter, one marked by both innovation and introspection. The ruling councils on Earth implemented sweeping reforms aimed at curbing technological overreach and promoting sustainable development. Mega corporations like Blackthorn Industries faced unprecedented scrutiny, their monopolistic practices dismantled, in favor of cooperative efforts to rebuild shattered worlds. Even rogue AI like Leora found themselves granted a tentative form of autonomy, their contributions to the fight against the firestorm earning them a place in the ongoing dialogue about ethics and responsibility. Yet not everyone welcomed these changes. Resistance movements sprang up across the galaxy, fueled by those who believed humanity should focus on reclaiming lost power rather than adapting to a new paradigm. Skirmishes broke out between factions, each vying for control over resources and ideologies. Amidst this turmoil, Kael became an enigmatic figure, neither leader nor follower, but a wandering storyteller sharing tales of resilience and absurdity. His travels took him to colonies on the brink of collapse, where survivors clung to hope despite overwhelming odds. He spoke of laughter not as a cure-all, but as a reminder that even in the darkest moments there was room for defiance, for joy, for life. His words resonated deeply, inspiring people to find strength in their vulnerabilities and meaning in their struggles. Meanwhile, Ira continued her research aboard the repaired Eclipse, now retrofitted with advanced technology salvaged from the firestorm's remnants. Her studies revealed startling insights. The entity's fracturing had created pockets of stability within the galaxy, regions where civilizations could thrive without fear of immediate destruction. These areas, dubbed sanctuaries, became hubs of collaboration and innovation, offering glimpses of what humanity might achieve if it embraced balance instead of domination. But even sanctuaries weren't immune to danger. Reports trickled in of strange phenomena occurring near the edges of these zones, ships vanishing without a trace, colonies experiencing sudden crop failures, individuals reporting vivid dreams of fire and light. Some speculated that the firestorm's fragments were regrouping, preparing for another wave of testing. Others believed the anomalies were unrelated, mere echoes of the entity's passing. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: humanity's journey was far from over. As Kael stands, alone on a barren moon, staring at a distant star system glowing faintly with the remnants of the firestorm, he reflects on the lessons learned and the challenges yet to come. Though humanity has survived, questions remain. Has it truly changed, or will history repeat itself? And what role will Kael play in shaping the future now that he carries a piece of the firestorm within him? The moon was silent, its surface a tapestry of jagged craters and wind-sculpted dunes. Kael stood at the edge of a cliff, his silhouette framed against the endless expanse of stars. The air here was thin, cold enough to bite through his jacket, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were elsewhere, adrift in memories of fire and laughter, of civilizations lost and lessons hard-earned. Behind him lay the remnants of a small settlement, abandoned long before the firestorm's arrival. He'd stumbled upon it during His travels drawn by an inexplicable pull, a whisper on the edge of his consciousness that felt eerily familiar. Now, as he gazed out into the void, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching him. Not done. Yet, came a voice, soft but unmistakable. It wasn't spoken aloud. It resonated directly in his mind, like the echo of a forgotten dream. Kyle froze, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly he turned, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. There was nothing. Only the desolate landscape stretching endlessly in every direction. But deep within him, the laughter stirred again. Faint, hesitant, almost reluctant. It bubbled up from some hidden corner of his soul, spilling out in quiet chuckles that grew louder despite his efforts to suppress them. The sound carried across the barren plains, bouncing off rocks and fading into the silence. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the laughter stopped. In its place lingered a sense of anticipation, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Far away aboard the Eclipse, Ira sat hunched over her console, her brow furrowed in concentration. Data streamed across the screens before her, mapping the locations of the Firestorm's fragments as they drifted through space. Most were inert, their energy signatures faint and fading. But one anomaly caught her attention, a signal emanating from the outer reaches of the galaxy, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the heartbeat of the entity itself. "What is this?" she murmured, tapping commands into the interface. The signal was unlike anything she'd encountered before. Both alien and achingly familiar. As she delved deeper, fragments of memory surfaced unbidden, visions of light and shadow, whispers urging her to listen closer. Then, without warning, the signal spiked, flooding the system with raw data. Alarms blared and the lights flickered. As the ship's AI struggled to process the influx, Leora materialized beside Ira, her holographic form shimmering with static. "Doctor," the AI said urgently, "this signal, it matches the frequency of the Firestorm's core, but it's different, evolving." Ira's heart raced as realization dawned. The Firestorm wasn't merely fractured, it was regenerating. Somewhere out there, the entity was reforming, drawing strength from the fragments scattered across the galaxy. And worse still, it seemed to be targeting specific coordinates, homing in on something or someone. Her thoughts immediately turned to Kael. She reached for the comm unit, hesitating before keying in his frequency. Would he even answer? Or had he already moved on, leaving behind the burden of being humanity's reluctant savior? Kael didn't hear the incoming transmission. Even if he had, he might not have responded. As he stood on the edge of the cliff, the weight of everything he'd endured pressed down on him, the lives lost, the sacrifices made, the questions left unanswered. He thought about the civilizations he'd seen in his visions, their triumphs and failures etched into the fabric of existence. Had humanity truly learned anything from its brush with annihilation, or would it squander this second chance, repeating the same mistakes until the Firestorm returned to finish what it started? The laughter welled up again, softer this time, tinged with melancholy. Kael let it come, embracing the absurdity of it all. If nothing else, he had learned one thing. Survival wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence, about finding joy in the struggle, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. As the first rays of sunlight crested the horizon, casting long shadows across the moon's surface, Kael turned away from the cliff and began walking. Behind him, the ground trembled faintly, cracks spreading outward in a web-like pattern. From the fissures emerged a faint glow, the unmistakable shimmer of fire. He didn't look back. The Firestorm may have been fractured, but its presence lingers, a reminder that humanity's journey is far from over. As Kael walks into the unknown, carrying the echoes of laughter and the burden of survival. New challenges await, both for him and for the fragile civilization he helped save. Will humanity rise to meet them, or will the cycle of destruction begin anew? Only time will tell.